The story begins with the long record of how ideas formed around the Yeti and the broader field of Himalayan legends. These ideas developed slowly, shaped by the rhythm of daily life in the communities that lived across the mountain slopes. People in these regions built steady routines that required careful attention to their surroundings. Their work, travel, and seasonal patterns created a deep familiarity with the land. Through this long familiarity, certain stories took shape. These stories were not created suddenly. They emerged over many generations, becoming part of the shared understanding of the region. One of the most enduring stories concerned a large, elusive being that moved through remote parts of the mountains. The accounts described a figure that walked upright and kept distance from human settlements. These descriptions were passed on calmly, without attempts at persuasion or dramatization. They were treated as part of the natural world, no different in tone from the mention of local wildlife or difficult terrain. Over time, these accounts became a stable part of local tradition, carried forward within families and communities that depended on careful awareness of their environment. As movement through the region increased, travelers from other places began to hear these stories. Some travelers came with the purpose of trade. Others passed through on administrative routes. Some arrived seeking spiritual centers located in the mountain valleys. When they heard the local accounts, they included small notes in their travel records. These early written mentions did not attempt to interpret the stories. They simply repeated what they had been told. Even so, these accounts slowly allowed the idea to spread beyond its original setting. The presence of an upright, human-like figure in the mountains drew interest from people who had never visited the region. This interest was quiet at first, appearing in scattered references. Later, as more travelers recorded their experiences, the references grew more frequent. Reports described footprints found in remote snowfields or unusual shapes seen from a distance during long journeys. Some reports came directly from the travelers themselves. Others relied on accounts shared by local residents. All of these small details contributed to the early structure of what would eventually become a well-known legend. The people who lived permanently in the mountains continued to treat these stories as a simple part of their environmental knowledge. They did not separate the Yeti from the rest of the natural landscape. The figure occupied a place in their understanding of the remote areas, much like the animals that moved through different elevations at various times of year. Because their survival depended on reading the land carefully, they paid close attention to patterns, changes, and long-term cycles. The Yeti, as they spoke of it, fit into these patterns rather than standing apart from them. When scholars began taking interest in the region, they encountered a combination of oral tradition, travel reports, and physical features of the terrain. Some scholars suggested that the stories might have begun with sightings of known wildlife, such as bears, that stood upright at times. Others proposed that the figure might represent an undocumented species. These ideas were examined in calm discussions rather than attempts to arrive at quick conclusions. The scholars compared various accounts and looked for patterns that might link them together. In doing so, they added new layers to the study of the Yeti, without replacing the older cultural foundations from which the stories arose. As interest persisted, some explorers organized expeditions to gather clearer evidence. They traveled into remote valleys, high passes, and regions where few people lived for long periods. The expeditions often returned with traces that seemed unusual, such as samples of hair, reports of large footprints, or objects believed to come from isolated areas. Scientists tested these materials, comparing them to known species from the region. Some samples matched known wildlife. Others produced uncertain results. Each analysis added another piece to the ongoing effort to understand what lay behind the long record of Yeti stories. While scientific study expanded, local traditions continued unchanged. Communities passed down their knowledge through spoken accounts, seasonal practices, and shared experiences on the land. The Yeti remained part of their cultural foundation. It represented a figure that existed in parts of the mountains, where people rarely traveled. It did not serve as a source of fear or fascination. It was simply a part of the world they recognized, shaped by generations of observation and memory. Outside observers continued to interpret the legend from their own perspectives. Some focused on the possibility of an unknown primate. Others viewed the legend as an example of how human cultures explain distant or unvisited places. Researchers in anthropology, biology, and history each brought their own methods and assumptions. Their studies sometimes aligned with one another and sometimes differed. Yet through all these discussions, the long-standing accounts from mountain communities remained central. They provided the foundation that allowed further study to continue. As more reports accumulated, the Yeti legend gradually reached a global audience. People far from the Himalayas began to form ideas about the figure, influenced by newspaper articles, travelogues, scientific studies, and accounts from climbers who spent long periods in remote areas. Some reports described footprints found during expeditions to high peaks. Others described shapes seen at a distance, unable to be confirmed. These accounts added to the long timeline of observations. Even when they did not offer clear evidence, they expanded the narrative and encouraged more inquiry. The study of the study. The Yeti soon extended into academic fields that examined how cultural stories develop. Some researchers explored how communities respond to unfamiliar elements in their environment. Others focused on how stories of elusive beings appear in many mountain regions around the world. They noted that such stories often serve practical functions, reminding people to respect certain areas or to remain aware of changes in the land. Within this broader pattern, the Yeti legend fits neatly as a long-term expression of life in a landscape that requires constant attention. From these layers of tradition, travel, science, and cultural reflection, the story continues onward. The early foundations remain steady, a figure described through calm accounts, moving through remote terrain, known through brief sightings and long memories. Over time, the story expands, adding new observations and interpretations without losing its original character. It forms a long thread that has moved across centuries, shaped by those who lived in the mountains and those who came later to study the region. As interest grew beyond the early accounts, a slow shift began in how people approached the subject. The Yeti was no longer mentioned only in passing references from travelers or within the steady traditions of the mountain communities. It began to attract attention from organized groups who wanted to study the region more closely. Some of these groups were composed of climbers seeking new routes across the high ranges. Others consisted of researchers familiar with animal behavior. Each group arrived with its own methods and expectations, and each added something new to the long history of the idea. When climbers entered the region with the aim of reaching some of the highest peaks, they spent long periods moving through remote terrain. They encountered stretches of land that few had crossed before in a single journey. During these movements, they sometimes found footprints that appeared larger than those of known animals. They reported these details calmly, noting the size, spacing, and pattern. These descriptions contributed to later discussions about whether the prints belonged to wildlife, weather effects, or something else. Some climbers recorded the details in journals, which were later shared with researchers. These journals became part of the expanding collection of material that shaped the modern phase of the legend. As these records circulated, researchers in various fields began to examine them. Some focused on the local wildlife, comparing the prints described in the journals to known species. They noted that bears in the region sometimes left tracks that appeared larger when snow conditions changed their outline. They also noted that bears could stand upright for brief periods, which might explain some of the distant sightings reported by travelers. Other researchers pointed out inconsistencies, suggesting that some prints seemed too widely spaced to match known species. These discussions remained steady and measured, reflecting the careful process of scientific inquiry. At the same time, researchers interested in cultural history examined how the legend fit into the long record of Himalayan beliefs. They studied old accounts, religious texts, and local stories passed down through generations. They found that the idea of a large, elusive being in the mountains appeared across multiple communities. Each group described the being slightly differently, but the overall picture remained consistent. This consistency suggested that the idea had deep roots in the region's cultural foundation. The researchers noted that such stories often served practical functions in guiding movement through challenging terrain, encouraging caution in remote areas where wildlife or natural hazards might be present. As scientific and cultural studies continued, new expeditions formed with the aim of collecting physical evidence. These groups traveled into areas where earlier reports had originated. They gathered hair samples, plant material, and other objects found near places where unusual prints had been reported. When these materials were studied, many were identified as belonging to known animals. Some samples matched local bear species, others matched livestock that had wandered into remote areas. A few samples remained inconclusive, not because they suggested something extraordinary, but because they were too degraded to test reliably. Even in these cases, researchers remained cautious and avoided reaching conclusions that the evidence could not support. The steady pattern of unclear but intriguing findings encouraged further study. For many years, small expeditions continued to explore remote valleys, not with the expectation of finding a new species, but with the aim of understanding how the legend fit into the broader landscape of the Himalayas. Some researchers noted that the mountains created natural conditions for stories about elusive beings to develop. The terrain was wide, difficult, and marked by seasonal changes that affected wildlife movement. Animals traveled along routes that humans rarely used. In these places, sightings were brief and often difficult to interpret. These conditions made it possible for stories to grow from incomplete observations. Meanwhile, the mountain communities continued to uphold their long-standing beliefs. They spoke calmly about the figure, describing it as part of the environment rather than a subject of curiosity. They did not draw sharp distinctions between the physical and the symbolic. For them, the Yeti represented something that had been present for generations. It held its place in their understanding of the land, shaped by the same rhythms that guided their daily lives. As more outsiders visited the region, these communities often found themselves answering questions about the Yeti. Their responses were steady and consistent. They repeated the same ideas expressed in earlier accounts. The figure was large. It walked upright. It kept distance from human activity. These descriptions did not vary significantly over time, suggesting a stable cultural memory rather than a changing story influenced by outside interest. Researchers noted this stability and considered it an important part of understanding the legend's longevity. In the mid-20th century, interest in the Yeti increased again as certain expeditions reported finding footprints at high elevations. These reports were shared widely. Some were accompanied by photographs that showed large prints spaced in a straight line. When researchers examined these photographs, they proposed several explanations. Some suggested the prints were created by known animals whose tracks had been altered by melting snow. Others proposed that the prints might have been shaped by weather effects. These explanations did not end the discussions. Instead, they added to the ongoing effort to understand how natural factors might influence sightings and reports. During this period, scientific testing methods improved. Researchers began analyzing hair samples using laboratory techniques that allowed for more precise identification. Several samples believed to be linked to unknown animals were matched to regional bear species. This supported the idea that many reports could be traced back to known wildlife. At the same time, some researchers continued to explore the cultural aspects of the legend, noting that scientific identification did not diminish the value of the stories themselves. The stories reflected ways of understanding the world developed through long experience in the mountains. As the years passed, the Yeti continued to move between these two spheres of thought. In one sphere, researchers examined physical evidence and sought explanations rooted in biology. In the other sphere, communities maintained their traditional understanding of the figure as part of the broader landscape of their lives. Neither sphere invalidated the other. Instead, they existed in parallel, each offering its own perspective on a story that had persisted for centuries. The modern phase of the legend also brought attention to how stories travel beyond their original context. Writers, researchers, and travelers carried the idea far from the Himalayas. As the idea spread, people added their own interpretations. Some presented the Yeti as a possible undiscovered species. Others treated it as an example of how human beings respond to unfamiliar landscapes. Through all these interpretations, the core of the story remained unchanged. It continued to rest on the simple accounts passed down through the mountain communities and the steady observations of those who spent long periods in the region. This phase of the story, shaped by scientific inquiry, cultural study, and continued local tradition, leads naturally into the next stage. Future studies drew on all the information gathered so far, creating a more complete picture of how the Yeti legend developed, persisted, and adapted over time. The story continues from here, moving deeper into the ways the legend influenced later generations and how it fits into the larger record of Himalayan history. As later generations turned their attention to the long history of the Yeti, they found that the story had reached a stage where it could be examined from many angles at once. Some focused on the scientific records gathered over decades of expeditions. Others studied how the legend moved through cultural traditions. Still others looked at the historical context in which early references appeared. Each approach provided a different view of the same idea, showing how a single figure could live within several kinds of knowledge. Historical researchers traced the earliest written mentions of the Yeti to reports made by travelers passing through the region. These reports were simple and brief. They often described what local residents had told them. The travelers did not try to explain the figure. They did not attempt to match it to known animals. Instead, they presented the accounts as part of what they had learned during their journeys. These early records provide a stable foundation for understanding how the story moved beyond the mountains for the first time. As researchers examined the broader historical setting, they noted that the Himalayas had long been a place shaped by movement and cultural exchange. People traveled through the region for trade, spiritual practice, and seasonal work. As they moved, they carried stories with them. The Yeti legend likely traveled in this way, not through dramatic retellings, but through quiet mentions shared among individuals moving along established routes. This pattern explains how the story spread gradually rather than through a sudden expansion. Cultural researchers approached the legend from another angle. They studied how the figure appeared in the beliefs of communities who lived permanently in the mountains. These communities maintained long-standing worldviews shaped by their environment. The Yeti held a place within this worldview as a being associated with places where humans rarely traveled. Researchers noted that such figures often represented more than a physical animal. They could also reflect ideas about boundaries, respect for remote areas, and the need for caution when moving through unfamiliar land. These interpretations helped explain why the figure persisted in cultural memory, even when sightings were rare. Biological researchers continued to examine physical evidence linked to the legend. Many focused on the possibility that known animals could account for the reported sightings. They studied the behavior of regional wildlife, noting that bears exhibited patterns that might match some of the accounts. Bears could stand upright for short periods, leaving impressions that might resemble human-like shapes from a distance. Their tracks could expand or distort under certain snow conditions, creating prints larger than their true size. Some researchers suggested that such natural processes could explain many reports that seemed unusual at first glance. At the same time, researchers did not dismiss the cultural knowledge behind the legend. They recognized that the mountain communities had spent generations observing the land and its wildlife. Their accounts were shaped by long experience rather than brief encounters. This made the study of the legend more complex. It required an approach that respected both scientific analysis and traditional knowledge. Researchers studying the Yeti gradually adopted methods that combined these perspectives, allowing for a more complete understanding of the story's development. Over the years, the legend reached a wider audience, partly because of increased travel to the Himalayas. Climbers seeking to ascend high peaks passed through areas linked to earlier reports. Some of them encountered unusual tracks or heard local accounts. Their journals became part of the growing body of written material on the subject. When these journals were published, readers far from the region encountered the Yeti legend in new forms. Some readers viewed the reports as evidence of unknown wildlife. Others saw them as part of the natural mystery connected to remote landscapes. In both cases, the legend gained more attention and more interpretations. As interest continued to expand, researchers began to study how the Yeti fit into the broader pattern of stories about large, elusive beings found in many mountain regions around the world. They found similarities in how these stories developed and persisted. Communities living in difficult terrain often spoke of beings that stayed far from human activity. These beings were seldom described in detail. Instead, they existed at the edges of human experience, appearing only in brief sightings or unexplained tracks. Researchers suggested that such stories reflected a combination of environmental knowledge, cultural beliefs, and occasional encounters with wildlife. The Yeti fit well within this pattern, showing how a local idea could align with broader human tendencies. Another part of the modern study of the Yeti involved examining how people outside the region responded to the legend once it became widely known. Some individuals were drawn to the idea of discovering a new species. Others were interested in exploring remote areas where earlier sightings had been reported. These motivations led to a series of expeditions that brought new observations. Some expeditions returned with reports of unusual tracks. Others found nothing unexpected. Even when the expeditions did not support earlier claims, they added more detail to the long record of exploration in the region. As more information accumulated, researchers began to see clear patterns in the reports. Many sightings occurred in areas where wildlife movement overlapped with human travel. Many tracks appeared during seasons when snow conditions could distort their shape. These patterns supported the idea that natural explanations could account for much of the evidence. At the same time, the consistency of the cultural stories suggested that the figure held meaning beyond these physical interpretations. The Yeti remained a stable part of the region's traditions, shaped by generations of experience. In recent years, advances in scientific testing provided more precise methods for analyzing physical samples. DNA analysis became more reliable, allowing researchers to identify the species represented by hair or other materials. Several samples once thought to be linked to unknown animals were identified as belonging to regional bear species. This supported earlier suggestions that bears accounted for much of the physical evidence. These findings did not bring the story to an end. Instead, they clarified some details while leaving room for further study of the cultural aspects that shaped the legend's long history. The Yeti, through all these phases of study, maintained its place as a figure that connected scientific inquiry with cultural tradition. Its story showed how ideas can travel across generations, shaped by both daily life and long-distance exploration. Researchers noted that the legend's endurance reflected the stability of the mountain communities that preserved it. Their calm, steady approach to the figure influenced every later stage of the story. With this understanding, modern researchers began to examine how the Yeti shaped the ways people from outside the region viewed the Himalayas. Some travelers approached the mountains with curiosity, influenced by the legend. Others used the legend as a way to frame their understanding of the region's history. In every case, the legend acted as a gentle point of connection between different cultures and different ways of knowing. In this way, the story continues to build upon itself. Each generation adds its own understanding, shaped by the evidence available at the time and by the cultural perspectives that guide their interpretation. The Yeti remains part of this ongoing process, a figure rooted in tradition, yet continually re-examined through modern methods. As the modern era brought new forms of communication, the story of the Yeti found its way into many kinds of discussion. People who had never traveled near the Himalayas came across the idea through printed reports, spoken accounts, or later through digital archives. These new forms of circulation did not change the core of the story. They simply placed it in more settings, allowing people from distant regions to engage with a tradition that had developed over centuries. With each new exchange, the legend gained another layer of interpretation, shaped by different interests and different questions. Researchers studying the spread of cultural stories noted that the Yeti followed a pattern consistent with long-lived legends. It began in a specific place, firmly rooted in local knowledge. Over generations, it expanded into wider awareness through contact with travelers. Later, it became the subject of organized study, each stage built on the one before it. The legend never replaced its earlier meanings. Instead, it absorbed new interpretations while remaining anchored to its earliest foundations. This pattern helped explain why the story endured even after scientific studies pointed toward natural explanations for many of the reported sightings. In the Himalayas, the legend continued to play a role in daily life. Communities still passed down their knowledge through spoken accounts, showing how cultural memory carried more weight than written analysis. For them, the story was part of a long tradition tied to the land. It did not require confirmation from scientific investigation. It did not depend on new evidence. It existed in the same steady manner as other long-standing beliefs shaped by generations of life in the mountains. Researchers observed that this stability offered insight into how knowledge systems form in regions where experience with the land is the primary source of understanding. Modern discussions of the Yeti often included references to earlier expeditions, showing how even uncertain findings continued to influence new generations of researchers. Many discussions returned to the footprints found during major climbing expeditions. These prints, photographed and described in detail, became a consistent reference point. Researchers analyzing these images noted that melting snow, wind, and shifting ice could alter the shape of tracks left by known animals. They suggested that the combination of weather and terrain could create impressions that looked unusual when viewed without context. These explanations were presented calmly, without attempting to dismiss the cultural significance of the legend. As scientific interest continued, some researchers explored possible biological explanations that had not been fully considered in earlier studies. They examined the evolutionary history of bears in the region, noting that multiple bear species lived across the Himalayas. These species included regional variations that might differ in appearance or behavior. Some researchers proposed that encounters with rare or less studied populations could have contributed to certain sightings. This idea fit well within the biological framework, offering a natural explanation that aligned with many of the physical reports. Other researchers considered whether the legend might have been influenced by encounters with traveling groups or isolated individuals unfamiliar to local communities. They noted that the Himalayas had long been a place where people moved along narrow routes that connected distant regions. Encounters between groups with different cultural backgrounds could lead to stories as each side tried to understand the other. In some cases, a brief sighting at a distance might later be described in simple terms, becoming part of a story that grew across generations. These researchers did not claim that such encounters explained every detail of the legend. Instead, they offered another example of how cultural stories can form from ordinary events. While these modern studies expanded the range of possible explanations, none of them replaced the earlier accounts. The original stories held by mountain communities remained unchanged. These stories continued to describe the Yeti as a being that avoided direct contact. This consistency fascinated researchers who studied the development of long-term cultural memory. They observed that stories often gain stability when they serve practical functions, such as marking areas where people should move with caution. In this context, the Yeti acted as a reminder of the unknown encouraging respect for remote places where hazards might be present. Historical studies also continued to deepen. Researchers examined old manuscripts, noting references that could relate indirectly to the Yeti. Some documents described figures linked to religious traditions that valued retreat into remote areas. These figures were not identical to the Yeti described in local stories, but their presence suggested that the idea of beings living in isolation had long existed in the region. Researchers noted that such ideas often became absorbed into local traditions, creating stories that blended spiritual, historical, and environmental elements. As research widened, some began to study how the legend influenced modern perceptions of the Himalayas. Travelers sometimes arrived with expectations shaped by stories they had encountered far from the region. Local communities observed these expectations and responded with calm explanations rooted in their long-standing knowledge. This interaction created a subtle exchange between traditional understanding and outside curiosity. Researchers noted that this exchange formed part of the modern evolution of the legend, showing how cultural stories adapt as new audiences encounter them. The influence of the Yeti legend extended into fields that examined how human beings understand landscapes. Some researchers focused on the concept of the unknown within natural environments. They noted that every region of the world held stories about beings that existed beyond the edges of familiar land. These stories often encouraged care, patience, and respect for places that were difficult to navigate. The Yeti fit into this global pattern, providing another example of how human experience shapes stories about unfamiliar territory. In addition to these broader studies, some researchers focused on the role of the Yeti in shaping local identity. They found that the figure provided a link between past and present, connecting modern communities to the experiences of earlier generations. The story held a place in local lives, festivals, teachings, and shared memories. It offered a way to acknowledge the long history of life in the mountains, marked by both continuity and change. This role helped explain why the legend remained steady, even as scientific studies developed detailed explanations for many aspects of the story. As time moved forward, the Yeti remained a subject that encouraged cooperation between disciplines. Researchers from biology, anthropology, history, and cultural studies often worked together, sharing findings to create a more complete picture. This cooperation reflected the complexity of the legend. It could not be understood through a single field alone. Instead, it required an approach that considered physical evidence, cultural meaning, historical context, and environmental understanding. Through this cooperation, researchers gained a clearer sense of how the Yeti legend developed and why it persisted. The long record of study, tradition, and exploration continues to hold the Yeti as a figure that carries both question and meaning. Many aspects of the story have been examined and clarified, yet the legend remains connected to ideas that extend beyond physical evidence. It reflects the long relationship between people and the land they inhabit. It reflects the ways communities understand their environment across generations. It reflects the quiet continuity of traditions shaped by steady contact with the mountains. As the study of the Yeti continued to unfold in the modern era, attention slowly shifted toward the broader landscape that shaped the legend. Researchers began to examine how long-term patterns of movement, settlement, and adaptation in the Himalayas contributed to the formation of stories that lasted for centuries. They noted that communities living in high-altitude regions often developed ways of understanding the land that were shaped by close observation over many generations. The Yeti, in this context, became one element within a much larger framework of knowledge passed through oral tradition. As researchers reviewed older accounts, they found that many early descriptions were based on brief encounters during travel through remote areas. Such encounters were often shaped by limited visibility, changing conditions, and the need to move steadily across demanding terrain. These circumstances could lead to impressions that remained fixed in memory, even when the events themselves were simple. Over time, These impressions became part of shared accounts passed from one group to another. This process created a chain of stories that grew gradually, connecting different communities through shared themes. Historical studies showed that trade routes across the Himalayas brought travelers from multiple regions into contact with one another. These routes did not only move goods, they also moved ideas, beliefs, and stories. The Yeti became one of many subjects discussed along these paths. Travelers repeated what they had heard, adding details based on their own understanding or on the stories they carried from their home regions. This steady movement of stories helped the legend expand beyond the areas where it first took shape. Researchers noted that such expansion often occurred without a clear moment of change. Instead, it happened slowly, almost unnoticed, as people continued their regular journeys. In examining these patterns, researchers also considered how isolation influenced the development of long-standing stories. Many villages in the Himalayas remained separated by long distances and difficult routes. This separation created environments where stories could develop independently, shaped by local experience. When these stories eventually reached other communities, the differences between them sometimes led to new interpretations. The Yeti, therefore, became a figure with variations depending on where the story was told. These variations were not contradictions. They reflected the natural changes that occur when traditions develop in separate places. As researchers compared accounts from different regions, they found that certain descriptions appeared more consistently. The Yeti was often described as a figure that avoided close contact, remaining distant from human settlement. This pattern matched the broader theme found in many Himalayan stories that emphasized caution around remote areas. The Yeti, in these accounts, served as a reminder of the boundaries between familiar land and places that required patience and respect. This interpretation aligned closely with the ideas held by communities who had lived near these areas for many generations. In addition to cultural studies, some researchers explored the ways in which language influenced the development of the Yeti legend. They examined how terms used in local dialects were translated into other languages by travelers and researchers. In some cases, the original meaning of a term shifted when translated, leading to new interpretations. These shifts helped explain how early reports written in foreign languages portrayed the Yeti in ways that differed from local stories. Language, therefore, played an important role in shaping the version of the legend that became known outside the Himalayas. As scientific analysis became more advanced, researchers also studied the physical environment of the Himalayas to understand how the land influenced human perception. They examined how tracks left by animals changed shape over time as they were exposed to movement and conditions. They found that tracks made by bears, snow leopards, and other animals could become distorted in ways that matched earlier descriptions. This research did not aim to dismiss cultural accounts. Instead, it sought to understand how natural processes could have contributed to certain sightings described by travelers. Researchers also considered the possibility that rare animal behavior might have influenced some accounts. They studied seasonal patterns of movement among large mammals, noting that animals sometimes traveled through areas where they were seldom seen. An unexpected encounter with such an animal could create a strong impression, especially if the observer had limited experience with the species. These studies offered another layer of explanation for sightings that formed part of the broader legend. While scientific studies focused on physical evidence, cultural studies continued to explore the social role of the Yeti. They examined how stories about the Yeti helped communities express values such as caution, endurance, and awareness of surroundings. The inclusion of the Yeti in teachings for younger generations showed that the figure served a function beyond simple storytelling. It offered a way to communicate lessons learned from long experience living in remote areas. Researchers observed that such functions helped explain why the legend remained steady, even as many aspects were examined from scientific perspectives. As time moved forward, scholars also looked at how the Yeti influenced artistic expression. They noted that the figure appeared in carvings, paintings, and narratives that reflected local history. These representations did not aim to provide literal depictions. Instead, they expressed the place the Yeti held within cultural memory. Through these works, the legend continued to evolve, shaped by each generation that contributed its own understanding. Researchers found that these representations help maintain the continuity of the story, allowing it to move across time without losing its central themes. In reviewing records from earlier centuries, researchers found that some accounts described encounters in terms that suggested a blend of observation and interpretation. Travelers sometimes relied on brief impressions, forming conclusions based on limited information. These conclusions, once recorded, became part of written history. Later readers often interpreted these accounts as objective descriptions, even though the original observations may have been influenced by factors that were not fully understood at the time. This pattern reflected a common challenge in historical research, where early accounts must be examined with attention to the context in which they were created. Modern researchers also noted that the Yeti legend served as a point of connection between multiple fields of study. It drew interest from biology, anthropology, history, linguistics, and cultural studies. Each field offered insights that contributed to a fuller understanding of the legend. This multidisciplinary interest showed that the story held value beyond questions of physical existence. It provided a way to study how human beings interpret their environment, how stories form, and how traditions endure. The long history of the Yeti also illustrated how stories continue to adapt. Even in modern times, new accounts occasionally surfaced, often shaped by contemporary experiences. These accounts differed from earlier descriptions in ways that reflected changes in daily life, travel, and communication, yet they remained connected to the underlying themes that had shaped the legend for centuries. Researchers observed that such continuity suggested that the Yeti legend had become deeply rooted in the broader narrative of the Himalayas. As these studies came together, they formed a picture of the Yeti that combined cultural tradition, environmental understanding, historical development, and scientific analysis. The legend did not depend on a single explanation. It reflected many layers of meaning, each of which added depth to the long record of stories. Through these layers, the Yeti remained a figure that encouraged reflection on how people engage with places that hold both familiarity and uncertainty. As interest in the Yeti moved into new periods of study, a slow shift began to form in how researchers described the broader environment in which the legend developed. They approached the Himalayas not only as a place with challenging terrain, but also as a region shaped by long cycles of settlement, travel, belief, and memory. This shift allowed them to understand the Yeti legend as part of a larger pattern of cultural expression tied to mountain life. The legend did not stand alone. It existed within a network of stories, practices, and shared understandings shaped by centuries of experience. In many regions near the high ranges, communities continued to use the Yeti as a reference point for places where movement required caution. These references pointed toward ridges, valleys, and stretches of land where weather and footing could change without warning. The figure of the Yeti functioned as a reminder of these conditions. It acted as a steady presence in local knowledge, helping each generation understand the challenges that came with life along narrow paths and high passes. Researchers noted that many cultural figures around the world played a similar role, emerging from practical needs rather than imaginative invention. As this understanding grew, research moved toward the careful examination of local accounts that had been passed from one family to another. Many of these accounts described the Yeti not as a single form, but as part of a wider set of beings that moved through remote regions. The descriptions varied depending on the area, suggesting that each community developed its own version based on its own environment. These differences strengthened the view that the legend was not the result of one event or one sighting. Instead, it was the outcome of a long history of observation, caution, and adaptation to the land. This pattern prompted further study into how cultural traditions form in regions where daily life is closely linked to the surrounding environment. Researchers found that when communities rely on the land for food, travel, and seasonal rhythm, stories emerge that reflect the conditions of that land. These stories offer guidance, reinforce memory, and create shared understanding. The Yeti, in this context, served as a symbol of unpredictable spaces. It represented areas where people needed to move with care, whether due to wildlife, weather, or shifting ground. At the same time, scientific studies continued to refine their conclusions about possible biological explanations for Yeti reports. The most consistent findings pointed toward bears, particularly species adapted to high-elevation environments. These bears showed seasonal changes in behavior, often moving in ways that could appear unusual to someone observing from a distance. Their footprints could change shape due to melting snow or drifting ice. When combined with the conditions of the terrain, these tracks could create impressions that resembled upright steps. Researchers documented these patterns over multiple seasons, creating a record that aligned with many earlier sightings. Other studies focused on the movement of animals across different elevations. Some species that typically lived at lower levels occasionally moved higher when food sources shifted. These movements could result in brief encounters with animals unfamiliar to people living in high-altitude settlements. Such sightings might later be described using terms shaped by local tradition. Over time, these descriptions could merge with existing stories, reinforcing the idea of a presence in remote areas. Parallel to biological research, anthropologists continued to document the cultural significance of the Yeti. They observed how the figure appeared in stories told during gatherings, in teachings shared with younger generations, and in accounts tied to specific places. These stories rarely included exact physical details. Instead, they focused on the nature of the Yeti as a being that remained distant, avoiding direct contact. This consistency suggested that the legend was less concerned with describing an animal and more focused on conveying a relationship between people and the land. Historical research into early travelers showed that many first-hand accounts described the Yeti through second-hand information. Travelers often relied on guides who shared local knowledge. These guides used terms familiar to their communities, which were then interpreted by travelers in ways shaped by their own backgrounds. This process sometimes produced descriptions that differed from the original meaning. Researchers studying these exchanges found that translation and interpretation played a large role in shaping how the Yeti was described in early written reports. Some records from the 19th and early 20th centuries showed how explorers viewed the Himalayas through their own cultural expectations. When they encountered stories of the Yeti, they saw them as evidence of a physical creature that might be discovered. For them, the idea of an unknown species was appealing. They documented their findings with care, often including detailed descriptions of tracks or distant shapes. These accounts contributed to the growing interest in the Yeti in regions far from the Himalayas. As more people became aware of the legend, the Yeti entered scientific discussions about the possibility of undiscovered species. Some researchers approached the subject through the study of cryptic mammals, focusing on species known only through limited evidence. They noted that many animals had been identified after long periods of uncertainty. However, as more data accumulated, no verifiable biological evidence for the Yeti emerged. The absence of physical confirmation encouraged researchers to consider cultural explanations with greater weight. This broader view helped unite various strands of research. Biologists provided evidence about wildlife and terrain. Anthropologists documented traditional stories. Historians traced early accounts. Cultural researchers examined how the legend shaped identity. Together, these perspectives formed a more complete understanding. The Yeti became an example of how stories develop at the meeting point between lived experience and the natural environment. In recent years, new methods of analysis added additional layers to the discussion. Genetic studies of hair samples collected from remote regions provided insights into which species might have been involved in sightings. Many samples matched known animals, especially bears. Some samples were too degraded to produce clear results, but none showed evidence of an unknown species. These findings supported earlier conclusions, while still leaving space for cultural interpretations of the legend. With these results, the focus of study shifted again toward cultural history. Researchers explored how the Yeti influenced art, stories, and local memory. They found that the legend served as a link to earlier generations who had relied on oral tradition. It offered a way to maintain continuity in regions experiencing change due to travel, communication, and shifting patterns of settlement. The Yeti remained a symbol of the long relationship between people and the mountain environment, shaped by both caution and respect. As research continued, the Yeti legend also became part of discussions about how knowledge is formed in landscapes where direct observation is limited. The high Himalayas present conditions that make travel slow and careful. Paths through remote areas can take days or weeks. Weather can change without pattern. In such settings, information spreads through slow, steady transmission. Stories become tools for organizing knowledge, helping communities remember important details about their surroundings. The Yeti's enduring presence reflects this slow rhythm. It represents the long process through which people understand their environment. It connects practical guidance with cultural meaning. It carries stories that reach back beyond written records, shaped by generations who lived close to the land. Even with modern research, the core of the legend remains tied to older patterns of thought. The story continues by following the gradual movement of Yeti research into more structured academic study. As interest grew, universities and independent groups began to collect earlier reports, compare them, and organize them into larger archives. This process created a stable base of material that could be examined with care. Researchers treated each account as a part of a broader record, noting the time, the place, and the circumstances of each sighting. They observed that many reports came from people who worked in remote environments over long periods, such as herders, guides, and members of climbing teams. Their descriptions varied in detail, but they often shared simple points that could be placed side by side for analysis. Over time, these studies revealed a pattern. Many of the reports occurred during periods of travel across high passes or on long routes between villages. These routes were shaped by terrain, weather, and seasonal needs. They demanded patience and attention. Individuals traveling through these areas sometimes moved during low visibility or along paths where distance made it difficult to judge size and shape. Researchers concluded that these conditions naturally increased the chance of uncertain sightings. This helped explain why many accounts included brief observations without further confirmation. The archives also included reports of tracks. These accounts were valuable because they provided physical impressions that could be measured and compared. Researchers analyzed the dimensions, spacing, and depth of the prints. They compared the measurements with known wildlife in the region. They also noted that changing conditions in snow could alter the form of tracks within a short period. Melt, drift, and compression could make a familiar print appear much larger or less defined. Through this analysis, researchers found that many reported tracks matched the patterns known from local bear species, especially when shaped by shifting snow. At the same time, researchers continued to examine the cultural history linked to the legend. They studied local stories that had developed before outside attention. These stories described the Yeti as a being that preferred isolation, moved across high terrain, and avoided contact with people. They were calm accounts that did not rely on dramatic detail. They reflected a long tradition shaped by experience in remote areas. Researchers noted that these stories often served practical purposes. They reminded people to show respect for regions where the land could be difficult to navigate. They encouraged care when traveling beyond familiar ground. As academic interest expanded, researchers considered the possibility that the legend had developed through a combination of real encounters and cultural interpretation. Encounters with wildlife, distant travelers, or rare natural events could have provided the initial base. Over generations, these moments became part of a broader narrative shaped by community memory. This pattern was consistent with the formation of many traditional stories in regions around the world. It offered a balanced understanding that acknowledged both the natural environment and the cultural context. The study of identity continued to grow as well. In some regions, the Yeti held a place in local teachings that emphasized endurance, cooperation, and awareness of the land. These teachings did not present the figure as a threat. Instead, they used the story as a guide for understanding remote areas where conditions demanded steady focus. Researchers found that these traditions helped maintain continuity between generations. They carried knowledge forward in a form that was simple to remember and easy to share. This role helped explain why the legend remained strong, even as modern explanations developed. Meanwhile, DNA research offered new possibilities. As samples such as hair, bone fragments, and environmental traces were collected, they were tested using improved methods. Many of the samples matched known species, especially bears and domestic animals. A few samples were difficult to classify due to degradation or contamination. These results supported the idea that most physical evidence could be explained through wildlife found in the Himalayas. Researchers did not present these findings as final answers. Instead, they offered the results as part of an ongoing record that continued to grow with each new study. Cooperation across scientific fields also increased. Biologists, anthropologists, geographers, and historians shared information across disciplines. This cooperation allowed researchers to form a more complete understanding. Biological studies offered insight into the animals of the region. Anthropological studies examined cultural knowledge and community traditions. Historical research provided context for earlier reports and documents. Geographical studies explained how terrain influenced sightings and travel patterns. Together, these fields created a balanced view that reflected the complexity of the legend. The Yeti remained a figure that encouraged reflection on how people understand the unknown. The Himalayas contained many areas that were difficult to reach. In earlier periods, these areas were even more remote. People living near the mountains formed their understanding of these places through experience, memory, and shared teachings. The Yeti became part of this process. It served as a reminder of the land's uncertainty. It encouraged respect for regions that demanded steady preparation and awareness. As the modern world changed, researchers observed that interest in the Yeti persisted because it represented a connection to long-standing traditions. Many stories around the world became tied to themes of discovery, identity, and endurance. The Yeti held a place in that wider pattern. Its story combined cultural continuity, natural explanation, and historical curiosity. It offered people a way to engage with the idea of the unknown without relying on spectacle or fear. The long history of the legend also provided a case study in how knowledge evolves. Early reports led to organized expeditions. Those expeditions produced evidence that could be studied. Later, laboratory methods added new layers of insight. Cultural analysis revealed the depth of local traditions. Historical research expanded the timeline of the story. Each stage added clarity while still leaving room for the broader meaning carried by community memory. This evolution showed how stories can remain steady even when new information is added. As research continued, the legend maintained a stable position within both cultural and academic contexts. Communities preserved their traditions. Scholars continued their studies. Travelers approached the region with curiosity and respect. The Yeti remained a figure that represented both the cultural heritage of the Himalayas and the natural patterns of the land. Its story moved forward through steady interest rather than rapid change. This ongoing movement shaped the present understanding of the legend. It was no longer seen only as an unexplained figure. It became part of a larger discussion about how landscapes influence memory, how people respond to uncertainty, and how long-standing traditions maintain structure across generations. The Yeti carried these ideas quietly through time, holding its place in the shared record of human thought. In the years when research methods became more structured, the study of the Yeti moved into a phase marked by careful comparison of earlier accounts. Scholars examined archived descriptions, travel notes, and expedition reports, placing them side by side to trace how certain ideas changed while others remained stable. They found that even when details varied, the core of the legend stayed tied to the mountains, to remote paths, and to long-held knowledge passed from one generation to the next. This continuity suggested that the legend held a deeper meaning beyond the surface of each report. As these comparisons grew more detailed, researchers saw that the earliest written references often preserved information that later accounts overlooked. These early sources tended to describe the Yeti in plain terms that reflected local beliefs rather than outside assumptions. They did not seek grand explanations. They simply described the idea as a part of the wider understanding of the land. This simplicity gave modern researchers a clearer view of the origins of the legend, revealing how closely it was tied to daily life and to the steady rhythm of mountain traditions. In time, new approaches emerged that drew on environmental science. Some researchers began studying how seasonal changes shaped the patterns that might have influenced reports of sightings. They examined how snow moved across slopes, how wind changed the shape of tracks, and how shifting ground could distort impressions left by animals. These studies created a quiet, methodical picture of how natural processes could produce forms that appeared unusual to travelers who were not accustomed to the landscape. This perspective helped explain why certain moments sparked curiosity while others passed without notice. Alongside environmental research, scholars of cultural history continued to uncover how the legend shaped and reflected human experience. They noted that stories about beings living in remote regions often served functions within communities. These functions ranged from reinforcing caution in dangerous areas to expressing ideas about balance between human presence and the broader environment. In this sense, the Yeti played a role that extended beyond the boundaries of any single account. It formed part of a larger framework through which communities related to the land. As these insights grew, attention turned to how the legend influenced the development of exploration in the region. Throughout the 20th century, many expeditions included the Yeti among their subjects of inquiry. Some carried equipment intended to record tracks, measure terrain, or collect samples. While most of these efforts found evidence that supported known species, the interest itself showed how deeply the legend shaped the expectations of those who entered the mountains. This influence remained present even when findings were limited or inconclusive. The steady accumulation of reports led researchers to reflect on how human understanding takes shape. They observed that the Yeti legend demonstrated the way belief, observation, and interpretation interact across long stretches of time. A single sighting could be influenced by previous stories, which in turn shaped how the sighting was described. Later readers, influenced by both the story and the description, would add their own interpretations. Through this process, a legend could grow without losing its core identity. As the study expanded, genetic analysis provided new avenues for investigation. Hair samples collected over many decades were examined with methods unavailable to earlier researchers. These tests suggested that many samples once thought to be unusual belonged to known species, often bears native to the region. Some samples showed links to populations that had not been studied in detail. These results brought clarity to parts of the record while leaving other questions open, particularly those rooted in local tradition rather than physical evidence. Even with these insights, the legend remained steady in the cultural life of the Himalayas. The Yeti continued to appear in stories shared during long journeys, at gatherings, and in quiet moments when older generations recounted memories from their youth. These accounts did not seek to challenge scientific findings. They existed in their own space, shaped by long-held experience rather than the need to prove or disprove anything. Researchers studying cultural continuity saw this as an example of how traditions remain strong even when new information becomes available. The persistence of the legend also raised questions about the nature of the unknown. Scholars noted that the Himalayas, with their remote valleys and high ridges, had long represented a place where human knowledge met its limits. In such settings, stories that acknowledged these limits helped maintain a sense of balance and respect. The Yeti formed part of this understanding. It represented an awareness that the mountains held more depth than could be grasped through brief visits or surface-level study. As these ideas developed, a new area of research focused on how the legend shaped interactions between local communities and visitors from distant regions. Observers noted that these interactions often involved a subtle exchange of knowledge. Local guides shared their understanding of the land, while visitors brought scientific tools and questions. This exchange created a shared space in which both forms of knowledge could exist without conflict. In this way, the legend quietly supported a bridge between traditions and new perspectives. Historical work also continued to deepen the timeline of the legend. Scholars examined older records from monastic archives, early travelers, and regional chronicles. Some references described solitary beings dwelling in remote places, often linked to themes of withdrawal and endurance. While these figures were not identical to the Yeti described in local stories, their presence showed that the idea of remote beings had long existed in the region's cultural memory. Over time, these ideas may have influenced one another, shaping the legend into its present form. In more recent years, interest in the Yeti has extended into fields concerned with how people relate to the unknown in a rapidly changing world. Some researchers suggested that the legend provided an example of how uncertainty can coexist with careful observation. Others noted that the Yeti illustrated how cultural stories adapt when new information becomes available. The legend did not disappear when scientific explanations emerged. Instead, it remained steady, holding a space that connected past and present. Through all these developments, the Yeti continued to serve as a reminder of the long relationship between people and the mountains. It showed how traditions take root, how they grow, and how they persist through change. It revealed how human beings seek understanding, not only through facts, but also through stories that reflect the rhythms of the places they inhabit. As this understanding deepened, the legend maintained its place as a part of the long narrative of the Himalayas. The story continued into new periods as researchers from many backgrounds began to revisit earlier material with steady interest. They looked at reports gathered during large expeditions and compared them with observations made in quieter settings by people who lived in the mountains. This careful comparison produced a clearer picture of how the legend had developed. Patterns began to emerge in which many sightings took place during moments of restricted visibility, or at distances that made detail uncertain. These conditions were common in the high mountain regions, where terrain shifted from one moment to the next. Researchers noted that such settings made it difficult to interpret movement at a glance, especially when wind, cloud, or snow influenced how far a person could see. These reflections helped explain why many accounts differed in details while sharing similar themes. As this work progressed, researchers also examined how memory shaped long-term tradition. They observed that communities often passed down accounts not as isolated events, but as part of a continuous understanding of the land. Each story was placed within a broader structure that connected the past with the present. This structure guided how people interpreted unfamiliar events. It allowed them to position new experiences within knowledge that had been formed through many generations. When someone saw a distant figure moving along a ridge or slope, the story of the Yeti offered a way to speak about that experience. It gave shape to uncertainty and created a sense of continuity between one sighting and another. In this way, the legend functioned as a bridge between different forms of knowledge. On one side stood the scientific attempts to classify, measure, and explain. On the other stood the cultural traditions that held meaning without depending on formal analysis. Researchers noticed that neither side invalidated the other. Instead, each provided a different angle from which to view the same long narrative. This perspective helped them understand how legends could persist even when natural explanations were available. A legend remained because it served a purpose beyond physical description. It anchored a community's relationship with its environment and its history. During this period, more attention was given to the role of the Yeti in social teaching. In some communities, the figure reminded people to move with care through remote areas. It encouraged respect for places that demanded patience and awareness. These teachings did not portray the Yeti as a threat. They framed it as a sign of the unknown, guiding people to approach difficult terrain with steady caution. Researchers studying cultural memory noted that this function aligned with practices found in many regions of the world, where stories helped people form habits that supported survival in demanding environments. The legend also influenced how outsiders approached the mountains. Many arrived with an expectation that they might encounter signs of the Yeti. Local guides sometimes encountered these expectations and responded with calm explanations, grounded in the history of the region. This exchange created a subtle interaction in which two kinds of understanding met. Outsiders brought curiosity shaped by stories they had heard elsewhere. Locals responded with knowledge shaped by long experience. These interactions did not erase the legend. Instead, they added new layers to its modern presence. As environmental studies expanded, some researchers examined how changes in climate and habitat might influence the movement of animals in the region. They considered whether rare encounters with bears or other wildlife might increase when food sources shifted. Such changes could influence how often people spotted animals in places where they were not commonly seen. This possibility provided another natural explanation for certain sightings. Even so, researchers noted that the legend did not rely on such explanations for its place in cultural history. The story remained steady even as the environment changed. Historical studies also continued to reveal new material. Scholars reviewing older travel accounts found occasional references to solitary figures, described in ways that resembled later reports of the Yeti. These early descriptions varied widely. Some described distant shapes. Others referred to stories told by local communities. Although these references lacked detail, they indicated that the idea of solitary beings in the mountains had existed for a long period. This supported the understanding that the legend was not a recent creation. It was part of a long tradition shaped slowly over time. As more material accumulated, researchers began to assemble these findings into broader narratives that traced the legend's development across centuries. They noted how certain ideas appeared, faded, and later reappeared in new contexts. They examined how early religious figures living in isolation could influence later interpretations. They studied how movement along trade routes might introduce new elements into local stories. Through this work, they showed that the legend had grown through many quiet changes rather than through sudden transformations. With this understanding, the story of the Yeti took on a calmer form in modern research. It was no longer seen as a mystery requiring urgent resolution. Instead, it became an example of how human beings shape meaning from their surroundings. It showed how stories can form through many small details accumulated across generations. It demonstrated how place, memory, and daily life influence the development of cultural narratives. This perspective also clarified why the legend remained so steady, even in the presence of new information. The story existed not as a single event, but as an ongoing record of how communities understood the land around them. It served as a reminder that knowledge comes from many sources. Some knowledge is formed through measurement and analysis. Other knowledge is formed through patient experience carried across long periods. Both forms contribute to a complete picture. The modern era added new questions to the study. Researchers considered how technology influenced the way people discussed the Yeti. Photographs, recorded interviews, and digital archives allowed information to move farther and faster than at any earlier point. This expanded the audience for the legend. It also introduced the possibility of misinterpretation, as people encountered fragments of stories without the full context. Researchers noted that this made calm analysis even more important. The legend needed to be examined with care to avoid conclusions shaped by incomplete understanding. Through all of these developments, the core of the story stayed connected to the mountains. It remained part of the identity of communities that had lived in the region for generations. It remained part of the long history of exploration. It remained part of the wider study of how human beings make sense of their environment. This connection formed a stable foundation on which the next periods of the story would continue. As the record moved forward, the study of the Yeti continued to reveal how legends shape and are shaped by human experience, showing that even as understandings shift, the quiet continuity of tradition endures. In the years that followed the early waves of scientific cooperation, interest in the Yeti continued to develop in a steady but quieter manner. Researchers from different regions returned to earlier findings and compared them with newer observations. They noted how the legend had adapted to shifts in knowledge while still preserving its oldest layers. This balance between change and continuity became a central part of the ongoing study. It showed that the story did not remain fixed yet, did not drift far from its original shape. Instead, it moved in a slow and thoughtful rhythm, shaped by both the passing of time and the stability of long-held customs. As more research teams spent extended periods in the Himalayas, their understanding of the region deepened. They observed how the land shaped movement, how it influenced settlement, and how it guided the development of local knowledge. The legend of the Yeti fit naturally into this structure. It functioned as a long-term record of how communities made sense of remote terrain. It acted as a reminder of boundaries, responsibilities, and shared experiences passed between generations. This gave researchers insight into how cultural memory forms without written records. It showed how stories evolve when shaped by daily life rather than formal study. During these long stays in the mountains, researchers also worked closely with local communities. They learned that the meaning of the Yeti varied slightly from village to village. Some communities described it with more detail, while others referenced it only briefly. These differences were not seen as contradictions. They reflected the way knowledge develops through local experience. Each community had its own history, its own seasonal rhythms, and its own encounters with the environment. This shaped how the story was told and retold. Over time, these variations formed a mosaic of understanding that enriched the broader picture rather than dividing it. Some researchers turned their attention to the way stories travel through generations. They studied how elders shared knowledge with younger individuals, observing the calm and steady manner in which traditions were passed down. The Yeti appeared within this process as a stable reference point. It provided a link between younger and older generations, acting as a marker of heritage. Researchers noted that its presence helped maintain continuity within communities that had faced many changes over time. These changes included shifts in trade, relocation of settlements, and new forms of contact with the outside world. Throughout these adjustments, the legend held its place. As long-term projects continued, more evidence emerged related to the animals that populated the region. Researchers examined tracks, collected samples, and compared results across numerous studies. They found that the biological explanation for many reported signs became clearer with each passing year. Different species of bears, especially those with wide ranges or seasonal variations in appearance, played a significant role in shaping many accounts. The behavior of these animals, combined with the difficulty of tracking movements in the mountains, helped explain how unusual sightings could occur. Researchers presented these findings with care, noting that natural explanations did not diminish the cultural significance of the Yeti legend. Some scholars focused on the development of early maps and travel records. They studied how outsiders had described the Himalayas before the modern era. These records often mentioned remote areas that were difficult to reach or document. Some travelers noted strange shapes or distant figures during long journeys. Although these descriptions were brief, they revealed how the region had long been associated with the unknown. Researchers concluded that such accounts likely contributed to the spread of stories beyond the local communities. They showed how impressions formed during travel could later influence broader discussions. While these historical records added perspective, they did not replace the deeper cultural understanding held by communities within the mountains. These communities continued to speak of the Yeti in a manner consistent with their long-established traditions. They viewed the legend not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a steady part of their heritage. It represented their connection to the land and their awareness of the challenges that came with living in remote places. Researchers who worked closely with these communities were careful to present this understanding with accuracy, avoiding interpretations shaped by outside expectations. In addition to cultural studies, some researchers explored how the story of the Yeti had influenced scientific methods. They observed that early expeditions had encouraged the development of new techniques in tracking, documentation, and analysis. These techniques later proved useful in unrelated studies. In this way, the legend contributed indirectly to advances in scientific practice. It showed how a cultural story could lead to innovations that extended beyond the original purpose of the research. This influence became a quiet but notable part of the Yeti's broader impact. Another area of study focused on how the legend shaped the way people understood the Himalayas as a whole. The mountains had long been seen as a place of endurance, patience, and long history. The Yeti became part of this perception, acting as a symbol of the region's depth and complexity. Researchers noted that stories about the Yeti encouraged people to approach the mountains with respect. They encouraged awareness of the challenges posed by the terrain. They encouraged recognition of the long traditions that had developed there. In this sense, the Yeti served as an entry point into a wider appreciation of the region. As time passed, discussions about the Yeti moved into new spaces. They appeared in academic conferences, museum exhibitions, and long-term research archives. These discussions often focused on how the legend reflected broader patterns in human understanding. Researchers examined how people respond to the unknown and how they create explanations for events that do not fit familiar categories. They found that the Yeti provided a clear example of this behavior. The legend combined direct experience, environmental knowledge, and cultural meaning, forming a complete story that could be studied from many angles. The role of the Yeti in modern thought continued to evolve. It maintained its place in the cultural memory of the Himalayas. It maintained its presence in scientific literature. It continued to inspire research, reflection, and steady curiosity. Each new study added another fragment to the long narrative. Each new observation revealed another connection between the legend and the land. Through this ongoing process, the story remained alive without changing its core structure. It moved forward in a calm and measured way, just as it had through earlier generations. In the years that followed the major scientific studies, interest in the Yeti settled into a quieter rhythm. Researchers no longer expected sudden discoveries. Instead, they approached the topic with patient observation. They returned to earlier findings and reviewed them with updated methods, recognizing that long-term understanding often came from slow, careful work rather than rapid breakthroughs. This steady pace matched the nature of the mountains themselves, where change occurred over long stretches of time and where each season shaped the land in predictable, gradual ways. During these years, communities across the Himalayas continued to share the legend in their customary manner. The story remained part of family teachings and small gatherings. It continued to appear in discussions about travel routes, seasonal patterns, and traditional practices. Although some elements of life modernized, the story did not fade. It moved quietly through each generation, forming a thread that connected different periods of time. Researchers who visited the region noted how easily the story fit into daily routines, showing how deeply it was rooted in the structure of community knowledge. New explorers traveled through the mountains during this period, though their goals differed from earlier expeditions. Many came to study climate, geography, or regional history. Some encountered references to the Yeti while speaking with local guides. These moments were often brief, included in explanations about specific areas or conditions. Observers noted that the story was presented in a calm, matter-of-fact manner, without emphasis or expectation. This approach stood in contrast to the dramatic accounts that sometimes appeared in distant places, showing how different contexts shape the tone of the narrative. As environmental research advanced, scientists gained a clearer understanding of the animal species living in the region. They gathered data on migration patterns, seasonal behavior, and population changes. These findings helped explain many of the events that had once been linked to the Yeti. For example, rare animal sightings in unusual places could often be connected to changes in food availability or weather patterns. Large footprints could be traced to bears whose tracks had altered shape due to shifting snow. Each explanation added detail to the broader picture of the region's ecology. Yet even with these explanations, the cultural story of the Yeti remained intact. Researchers studying cultural resilience observed that legends did not disappear simply because physical explanations became available. Instead, legends continued to exist alongside scientific knowledge, serving a different purpose. They offered continuity, identity, and connection to past generations. They reflected long-term relationships with the land. They provided structure to memory. These roles could not be replaced by scientific data, which served a different kind of understanding. During this period, several scholars examined how early travelers had shaped global perceptions of the Yeti. They reviewed expedition journals, photographs, and reports, noting how certain descriptions had influenced later expectations. Many early accounts had been written in plain language, yet when these accounts reached distant readers, they often gained additional emphasis or interpretation. Over time, these interpretations became part of the broader story, even though they differed from the tone used in the Himalayas. This slow transformation offered insight into how stories evolve as they move between cultures. Some modern historians focused on how regional governance, trade routes, and long-term settlement patterns may have shaped the development of the legend. They noted that remote areas often held stories about beings that lived beyond regular travel paths. These stories encouraged caution and patience in regions where weather, terrain, and wildlife created natural hazards. In this sense, the Yeti functioned as a reminder to move slowly and attentively through certain areas. This practical role likely helped the story endure over long stretches of time. Researchers also documented the way the legend appeared in art, ceremony, and local instruction. In many communities, the Yeti was included in symbolic representations that reflected long-standing relationships with the surrounding environment. These representations did not aim to provide physical detail. Instead, they expressed ideas about remoteness, resilience, and respectful movement through the mountains. Scholars studying these traditions observed how they maintained stability, even as other aspects of life gradually shifted. In the wider world, interest in the Yeti rose and fell across different decades. Some periods saw renewed attention due to reports or scientific findings that circulated through public media. In other periods, the topic received little notice. Through these cycles, the core of the story remained steady within mountain communities, unaffected by the changing levels of attention from distant audiences. This contrast further demonstrated the distinction between local tradition and outside curiosity. In time, the Yeti came to represent more than a single figure in regional stories. It became a point of study in fields concerned with how human groups interpret the unknown. Researchers explored how people made sense of unfamiliar forms, movements, or environments. They examined how long-term memory shaped explanations across generations. The Yeti provided a clear example of how communities integrate observation, caution, and cultural meaning into a single, enduring narrative. As the study of the Yeti reached the modern era, cooperation between disciplines became even more common. Biologists contributed insights from DNA research. Anthropologists provided analysis of oral history. Historians offered context drawn from regional archives. Geographers incorporated knowledge about climate and terrain. Together, these contributions formed a broad, steady body of work that helped clarify which aspects of the legend stemmed from physical events and which reflected cultural continuity. Yet even with this wide range of study, the story retained an element that could not be reduced to data. It remained connected to the lived experience of the mountains. It reflected the long passage of time in a region where generations marked their presence through stories rather than written records. It continued to represent the sense of respect with which people approached remote places. For this reason, the story held a place not only in scientific archives, but also in the quiet rhythms of everyday life in the Himalayas. The story continues from the steady path already formed, moving further into the long history of how the Yeti remained present in thought, research, and quiet tradition. As the late 20th century progressed, more groups traveled through the Himalayas with organized plans to observe wildlife, document remote environments, and gather biological samples. These projects often had broad goals that extended beyond the search for any single creature, yet the idea of the Yeti still appeared in their planning. Teams acknowledged that local accounts formed part of the cultural landscape, so they prepared to listen with care when communities shared knowledge shaped by generations of life in the mountains. Researchers traveling through high-altitude valleys sometimes noted how environmental conditions shaped movement for animals and people alike. Life in the region required steady awareness of shifting terrain and seasonal patterns. These observations offered more insight into how early accounts of unusual tracks or distant figures might have formed. A single path, used by both animals and travelers, could create overlapping marks. Snow pressed by one movement and reshaped by another could form impressions that lacked clear boundaries. Studies of track formation showed that many factors contributed to the final shape of a print, especially in regions where snow layers changed throughout the day. These findings did not aim to dismiss earlier reports. Instead, they placed them within a steady understanding of the environment. Each piece of evidence was considered with the same calm attention researchers used for studies of any species in the region. Many noted that natural explanations often aligned with the physical features described in historical accounts. Bears moving on hind limbs, for example, could appear taller than expected when seen from a distance. Their tracks, altered by snow and wind, could take on unfamiliar shapes. These suggestions were presented as possibilities rather than final conclusions. The legend itself remained separate from the scientific framework, continuing to hold its place within local traditions. At the same time, researchers studying human history in the Himalayas found new sources that added context to the long tradition of stories about remote beings. Archaeological surveys uncovered evidence of early settlements and trade routes that moved across difficult terrain. These findings showed how people had adapted to the mountains through many centuries. The presence of these routes suggested that travelers might have encountered unfamiliar groups or individuals who lived away from the main paths. In rare cases, such encounters could have formed the basis for early stories that later evolved into descriptions of the Yeti. These suggestions were not framed as definitive explanations, but rather as examples of how cultural stories sometimes grow from interactions between distant communities. As environmental science advanced, some researchers examined the region's wildlife from a genetic perspective. They collected samples from bears, goats, yaks, and other species that lived across the Himalayas. These studies helped clarify the relationships between different bear populations, including regional variations that had not been extensively documented before. Some genetic findings suggested that certain bear populations had diverged long ago, forming subgroups with distinct traits. These details offered further explanation for reports of unusual physical features described in some Yeti accounts. The presence of rare or isolated bear populations could create conditions for sightings that differed from expectations shaped by more common species. The collected data also brought renewed interest in how the Yeti legend fit within the broader history of the region. Cultural scholars examined how traditions related to nature had shaped community life. In many parts of the Himalayas, stories served practical roles by encouraging caution in regions where weather, isolation, or wildlife presented risks. The legend of the Yeti, with its steady presence across generations, provided one example of how communities use stories to reinforce awareness. The figure did not require detailed description or consistent physical traits. Its purpose lay in its association with remote places where conditions required patience and respect. Researchers also noted how the Yeti legend reflected the balance between familiarity and uncertainty that shaped life in the Himalayas. People who lived in the mountains often recognized subtle changes in the environment that visitors might overlook. This clarity of awareness allowed them to navigate terrain that appeared complex to outsiders. The presence of a story about a figure that remained unseen but possible offered a way to acknowledge that some aspects of the land remained beyond direct knowledge. This idea aligned with many traditions around the world, where stories about beings in distant places marked boundaries of the known environment. During this period, interest in the Yeti also appeared in wider global discussions about conservation. Some researchers suggested that attention drawn by the legend could support efforts to protect habitats where rare species lived. Although the Yeti itself was a figure shaped by tradition, the environments associated with the story held significant ecological value. These regions supported species that were difficult to study due to limited access and harsh conditions. Conservation groups occasionally referenced the Yeti to draw attention to these habitats, presenting the legend as part of the long relationship between people and the land, rather than as evidence of an unclassified species. Meanwhile, local communities continued to hold the Yeti as part of their enduring cultural memory. The figure remained present in teachings, stories, and shared accounts linked to family history. These stories did not need alignment with scientific findings. They existed within a separate understanding of the world, shaped by experience, tradition, and the passing of knowledge across generations. Researchers noted that this form of continuity was common in regions where cultural practices were closely connected to the environment. The story's steady presence served as a reminder of the long history of human life in the mountains. As the early 21st century began, interest in the Yeti continued through various types of research. Genetic studies, historical analysis, linguistic work, and environmental surveys all contributed to a broader understanding of the legend's origins and development. Many scientific findings pointed toward natural explanations for physical evidence linked to the Yeti. Yet none of these findings reduced the cultural meaning held by the figure. Instead, they showed how stories can exist in parallel with scientific understanding, each fulfilling different roles. In this period, researchers also reflected on the influence of early exploration efforts. The footprints reported during major expeditions remained part of the discussion, serving as examples of how specific pieces of evidence can shape long-term public interest. These early reports continued to appear in research, not because they supported the existence of an unknown species, but because they demonstrated how human interpretation interacts with challenging environments. The study of these prints contributed to a broader understanding of how observations form under conditions where clarity is limited. Discussions also continued regarding how the Yeti influenced the global view of the Himalayas. The legend contributed to a sense of depth and history associated with the region. Even as scientific studies clarified many aspects of the physical world, the Yeti remained connected to ideas about endurance, tradition, and the passage of knowledge through time. Researchers observed that the legend persisted not because of physical evidence, but because it represented a long-standing relationship between people and the land. This steady progression of research, reflection, and tradition continues to guide the story forward, linking the Yeti to the evolving understanding of the Himalayas and the people who have shaped its history across many generations. As the account moves further into the later stages of the modern period, the Yeti continues to hold a place in research, public discussion, and local tradition. The legend persists with a steady presence, neither rising nor fading, but maintaining a quiet role within the larger history of the Himalayas. This stage shows how a long-standing story adapts to new conditions while keeping its core structure unchanged. It also shows how different forms of knowledge continue to coexist without conflict, even when they arise from different methods and priorities. In the years when genetic studies gained broader use, researchers began collecting samples from remote regions to study the wildlife population. These studies focused on hair, bone fragments, and other small pieces of organic material found along trails or near shelters used by animals. Many samples were submitted by people who believed they might be linked to the Yeti. When these samples were analyzed, most were identified as belonging to known animals, including several species of bears common to the Himalayan region. A few samples were traced to rare regional bear populations, which helped clarify previous uncertainty about some reported sightings. These findings added new detail to scientific understanding, while also emphasizing the difficulty of identifying animals in challenging terrain. Genetic analysis provided clear results for many cases, but it did not end the broader story. The legend remained part of cultural tradition, and the presence of scientific explanations did not diminish its place in daily life. In many communities, the Yeti continued to serve as a figure tied to caution, respect, and awareness during travel through remote areas. This cultural function operated independently from scientific findings. It reflected the long history of living in an environment shaped by steep roots, shifting conditions, and long distances between villages. The story held a practical value that did not depend on biological identification. Researchers studying cultural traditions noted that the persistence of the legend showed how stories operate within community life. They observed that the Yeti was not used to explain every unfamiliar event. Instead, it appeared in specific situations that had developed meaning across generations. This selectiveness suggested a stable pattern rather than a broad attempt to describe the unknown. The stability reinforced the idea that the legend served as a guide point within a complex environment rather than an explanation for all natural events. This understanding clarified why the story endured, even as scientific studies provided detailed accounts of local wildlife. As research continued, some scholars focused on the broader historical context of the Himalayas. They examined records of long-distance trade routes, noting how the movement of goods and people often introduced new ideas that blended with existing traditions. In this environment, stories could shift gradually as they traveled along these routes. The Yeti legend appeared to fit within this pattern, with early references expanding across regions and continuing to evolve as they encountered new audiences. These scholars emphasized that such change did not weaken the story's foundation. Instead, it showed how cultural memory adapts to changing circumstances while keeping its essential form intact. Other researchers explored how the legend influenced the global understanding of the Himalayas. They found that the Yeti often appeared in discussions about the region's history, environment, and exploration. This presence shaped expectations for many people who had not experienced the region firsthand. Local communities responded calmly to these outside perceptions, explaining the long tradition behind the story and the difference between cultural meaning and physical evidence. This exchange demonstrated how the legend functioned as a point of connection between local knowledge and global curiosity. During this period, interest in conservation increased. Many researchers studying the Yeti also began documenting the habitats of species that lived in the upper elevations of the Himalayas. Their work revealed the importance of preserving these environments not only for scientific reasons, but also for the continuity of cultural traditions. The presence of large mammals, including several species of bears, depended on the stability of the region's ecosystems. Conservation studies showed that habitat changes could alter patterns of animal movement, which in turn influenced reports of sightings. These findings helped integrate ecological understanding into the broader discussion of the legend. Some scholars examined how the Yeti story functioned across multiple fields of study. They noted that the legend connected biological research, cultural history, environmental studies, and anthropology. This intersection made the story unique among long-standing legends, as it encouraged cooperation between different academic areas without requiring them to merge their approaches. Each field contributed its own perspective, expanding the understanding of the story without attempting to reduce it to a single explanation. This cooperation allowed the legend to be studied in a balanced way that respected both scientific detail and cultural continuity. As time progressed, interest in the Yeti continued to appear in new contexts, including education and archival documentation. Materials related to past expeditions, local accounts, and scientific studies were preserved in collections that aimed to record the evolution of the legend. These archives provided a clear view of how the story moved through different periods, how details shifted, and how certain elements remained constant. Archivists noted that the steady structure of the legend helped people trace the development of knowledge across many generations. It also offered a clear example of how stories can bridge the gap between local memory and broader historical record. In the Himalayas, the story continued to hold a place in community gatherings, seasonal routines, and shared local history. Its presence remained calm and consistent. It shaped travel advice, guided awareness of remote areas, and provided a reference point for discussing the unknown. This role did not rely on dramatic detail. It relied on steady transmission across generations. The quiet endurance of the legend showed how cultural knowledge remains stable even when new information becomes available. As global awareness expanded further, the Yeti appeared in discussions about the relationship between people and the environments they inhabit. Researchers studying this relationship noted that legends often form when daily life intersects with challenging terrain. These stories encourage steady attention to the land, helping communities navigate conditions that require care and patience. The Yeti fit well within this framework, providing another example of how human understanding develops through direct experience with the natural world. Scientific studies continue to provide clarity on many physical aspects of the region, yet none of these studies replace the broader cultural meaning of the legend. Instead, they complemented it by offering more detail about the environment in which the story developed. The Yeti remained part of a long record of life in the Himalayas, shaped by generations of observation, belief, and experience. It stood at the point where tradition, environment, and inquiry met, forming a steady presence across time. As interest in the Yeti continued into later years, new approaches began to center on long-term patterns rather than single events. Researchers gathered information from decades of reports, comparing details across time. They found that the descriptions remained steady in their general form, even when the accounts came from different periods. This consistency suggested that the story was not shaped by rapid changes or sudden influences. Instead, it developed gradually, moving through many years of shared memory. The slow pace of this development became a point of focus for studies that examined how stories persist over long periods. This long view also revealed changes in how people thought about the land itself. Early accounts described the mountains as remote, difficult to reach, and rarely crossed. Later periods showed an increase in movement through the region as more travelers passed along established routes. Despite these changes, the story of the Yeti remained attached to areas that were less traveled. Researchers noted that this pattern aligned with the idea that stories often form around places that hold an element of uncertainty. These places did not need to be unknown. They only needed to remain beyond the areas where people moved in large numbers. As part of this wider study, some researchers examined the relationship between the Yeti legend and the broader history of Himalayan exploration. They found that the legend had surfaced during many stages of travel in the region. It had been noted by early survey teams, climbing groups, scientific expeditions, and cultural researchers. Each of these groups had approached the story from different perspectives. The early survey teams often focused on mapping and measurement. The climbing groups focused on terrain and conditions. Scientific expeditions focused on biological and environmental details. Cultural researchers focused on the traditions of local communities. When these perspectives were viewed together, they formed a detailed record that extended across many decades. Despite the wide range of interests, the story itself remained stable. It did not rely on the conclusions of any single group. It continued because it was carried by a long line of shared knowledge. This observation helped researchers understand why the legend held steady, even when modern explanations pointed toward known animals or environmental conditions. The story existed as part of a broader cultural framework that did not depend on physical evidence. It continued because it was linked to the way people understood the land, the seasons, and the patterns of life in the region. When researchers reviewed the scientific findings related to the legend, they noted that most physical traces were consistent with known animals. Footprints matched the size and shape of bears that lived in the area, though snow and weather often distorted the details. Hair samples examined in laboratories matched species found throughout the Himalayas or nearby regions. Audio recordings, when available, aligned with known wildlife. These results did not undermine the cultural story. Instead, they provided a clear distinction between the scientific record and the traditional narrative. The two formed parallel lines of understanding that did not need to resolve into one explanation. Some researchers turned their attention to the broader role of large animals in Himalayan history. The region had long been home to many species adapted to steep terrain and changing weather. Over time, the movement of animals across the mountains formed patterns that shaped human knowledge. These patterns contributed to the development of stories meant to guide behavior, especially in areas where travel required caution. The figure of the Yeti fit into this tradition, serving as a reminder to remain alert in remote places. Researchers noted that such stories often held practical value, even when they described beings that did not match known species. Over the years, discussions about the Yeti also influenced how people outside the Himalayas perceived the region. Many individuals first encountered the story through second-hand accounts that focused on the unknown. These accounts sometimes simplified the complex history of the legend. Local communities recognized these simplified versions, but continued to share their own knowledge in a steady, unchanged manner. This difference between external descriptions and internal traditions became a subject of study for researchers interested in cultural exchange. They found that such differences often arose when stories traveled far from their original setting. In this context, the Yeti became an example of how ideas shift as they move across large distances. Outside interpretations sometimes focused on the question of physical existence. Local interpretations focused on the place of the story within everyday life. These two perspectives did not compete. They simply reflected different ways of understanding. Researchers saw value in studying both, noting that the full history of the legend could only be understood by looking at all layers of meaning. As studies continued, some researchers examined the role of the legend in shaping awareness of conservation. The Himalayas were home to many species with limited ranges. These species relied on specific habitats that could be affected by changes in climate or land use. The legend drew attention to the presence of rare animals living in remote areas. While the Yeti itself did not appear in physical surveys, the attention it brought to wildlife conservation contributed to larger discussions about preserving the ecosystems of the region. This connection showed how cultural stories could influence modern concerns in indirect ways. With each passing decade, more information became available about the natural history of the Himalayas. Studies showed patterns of migration, adaptation, and evolution among animals living at high elevations. These studies deepened the understanding of how life developed in the mountains. They did not replace earlier stories. Instead, they added another layer to the long relationship between people and the land. The Yeti remained part of this relationship, representing a figure linked to places where knowledge had been shaped by many generations. Some researchers began to focus on how the legend functioned as a marker of cultural continuity. They observed that stories passed down through many generations often served as a way to connect present life with the experiences of earlier communities. These stories preserved details about the environment, including landmarks, seasons, and areas where caution was needed. The Yeti legend fit this pattern. It carried within it a long memory of life in the mountains, shaped by countless encounters with the land. The story also demonstrated how cultural memory can remain stable even as the world around it changes. Travel routes expanded, scientific studies advanced, communication became faster, yet the legend held its familiar form. It continued to describe a figure known for avoiding direct contact, associated with remote areas, and linked to a sense of respect for the mountains. This enduring form pointed to the deep roots of the story, showing how it had been shaped by steady experience rather than sudden invention. As the modern era moved forward, researchers noted that the story of the Yeti still encouraged careful thought about the unknown. It reminded people that landscapes contain details that are not always visible. It encouraged patience when forming conclusions about unfamiliar places. It showed how knowledge develops gradually across generations. These qualities helped explain why the legend continued to hold meaning for many people, regardless of their background or field of study. The long history of the Yeti therefore remained a subject that connected past and present. It continued to show how human understanding evolves, while retaining links to earlier ways of thinking. It stood as an example of how stories reflect both cultural values and environmental knowledge. Its place in the history of the Himalayas remained steady, shaped by the experiences of those who lived in the mountains and those who studied them from afar. More developments followed in later years, carried by the same steady rhythm that defined the long path of the story. The story continued into a period shaped by steady reflection. Earlier studies had examined the legend through varied methods, each adding new understanding, yet none claimed to close the subject. The legend continued to rest within the wider history of the Himalayas, shaped by the same quiet patterns that guided earlier generations. As researchers reviewed the long path of ideas, they noted how each stage connected to a slow and continuous thread. The story did not move through sharp changes. It moved through gradual steps that built upon one another, without urgency and without conflict. This steady movement offered a clear view of how the legend had shaped human understanding across time. It showed how people approached remote landscapes with the same sense of care across centuries. It showed how stories acted as guides when written knowledge was limited. It also showed how communities formed relationships with the land that did not depend on strict classification. Researchers who studied this pattern noted that it offered a useful example of how cultural memory interacts with lived experience. As the years continued, the Yeti remained part of this ongoing dialogue. It did not require new sightings to remain present. It lived within records, teachings, and spoken traditions that passed quietly through time. Those who studied these traditions observed that cultural stories often survive because they serve steady functions. The Yeti encouraged calm awareness of remote areas, respect for possible dangers, and understanding of the land's long history. These functions remained unchanged, even as modern explanations became more detailed. Work in anthropology showed that the legend also played a role in how local communities presented their own history. The figure represented a link to ancestors who had traveled through mountain passes, long before modern borders or technology. It represented memories that extended beyond written timelines. It also represented a steady presence that connected people to a deep record of living with the land. Anthropologists noted that this connection formed a stable foundation for cultural identity. Studies in biology continued as well, though with a clear sense of the limits of available evidence. Researchers examined genetic material from animals known to inhabit the region, refining earlier conclusions about bears and other wildlife. These studies helped clarify how environmental factors could shape reports from earlier explorers. Some findings showed that certain species displayed rare behaviors during specific seasons. Others showed that their tracks could appear unusual under particular weather conditions. This research did not attempt to remove the cultural meaning of the legend. It simply provided a structured way to understand the physical environment that surrounded the story. Historical research added further continuity by examining how the legend appeared in older records. Some accounts described travelers who moved through the region for trade or pilgrimage. These accounts sometimes referred to distant figures seen on ridges or slopes. The descriptions lacked detail, yet they suggested that people had long recorded brief encounters with beings they could not identify. Historians observed that such records often served as early markers for stories that later developed into more stable traditions. In many fields, the legend prompted questions about how people organize knowledge about remote spaces. Researchers found that the Yeti served as a reminder that landscapes can shape understanding in subtle ways. The Himalayas presented challenges that influenced how communities interpreted unfamiliar sights. This interpretation was neither exaggerated nor mistaken. It was a natural response to life in a demanding environment. It reflected practical needs and quiet observation rather than speculation. As the story continued into the present, it remained clear that the legend was shaped by balance rather than certainty. It combined physical reports, cultural knowledge, environmental awareness, and historical memory. Each element contributed to a picture that was neither complete nor incomplete. It simply reflected the state of understanding at each moment in time. This pattern allowed the legend to remain steady while still accommodating new ideas. Modern discussions about the Yeti often focused on what the legend represented rather than attempting to settle its nature. Some discussions viewed it as a symbol of unexplored knowledge. Others considered it part of a cultural heritage shaped by long tradition. Others saw it as an example of how stories guide human relationships with place. In each case, the focus was not on resolution. It was on how the story formed part of a broader human experience. The legend also played a role in how researchers studied the interaction between knowledge systems. Traditional knowledge provided insight into long-term observation. Scientific study provided structured methods for examining physical evidence. Historical work offered clarity about earlier periods. Cultural analysis showed how traditions adapted to new circumstances. Together, these fields created a steady picture of how the Yeti existed across generations. This picture showed a legend that moved gently alongside the people who lived in the Himalayas. It adapted as needed, but never lost its foundation. It shaped thought without demanding belief. It provided guidance without requiring explanation. It lived within a landscape where people relied on memory, patience, and careful movement through the land. Its endurance reflected the persistence of these values. Looking back across the long history of the legend, researchers saw a continuous thread marked by calm development. The story began in local traditions that carried practical understanding. It expanded as travelers carried it into other regions. It became part of organized study when explorers recorded their experiences. It grew further as modern disciplines examined its cultural and biological context. Each stage added depth without replacing earlier meanings. Each stage remained connected to the same broad history. The Yeti remained a figure tied to caution, respect, and awareness of the unknown. It represented the quiet presence of possibilities that existed beyond immediate understanding. It showed that even when physical explanations were available, cultural stories continued to hold value. They shaped how people viewed their surroundings. They offered continuity through time. They formed links across generations. In this way, the legend held a place that did not depend on certainty. It simply remained part of the broader story of the Himalayas. It reflected both the region's physical features and its cultural history. It showed how understanding develops slowly, shaped by both observation and tradition. It demonstrated how people interpret unfamiliar experiences through the knowledge available to them. It offered insight into how landscapes influence human thought. As the story reached its present form, it stood as a long record of interaction between people and place. It showed how traditions endure through steady transmission. It showed how scientific study enriches understanding without displacing cultural meaning. It showed how history preserves quiet traces of earlier encounters. It showed how the Yeti remained part of a continuing story, marked by calm continuity and gentle change. And so the story comes to rest for now. Another piece of the past, placed gently into perspective. Thank you for listening, and may the quiet of the night carry you the rest of the way into sleep. Good night.